Single dad calmed the baby of a millionaire woman CEO. What she did next will break your heart. The airport was buzzing with its usual mix of impatience and exhaustion. Delayed flights, long queues, and tired travelers slouched in every corner of the waiting lounge. Among them sat Ethan Cole, a 34-year-old single dad, cradling his wailing baby girl, Lily, in his arms. His eyes were weary from sleepless nights and constant worry, but his hands gently rocked his daughter with the tenderness only a loving parent could offer. Across the terminal, Rachel Bennett, CEO of one of the biggest tech companies in the world, sat in first-class priority seating, laptop open, fingers flying across the keyboard. She was the definition of polished success, power suit, perfectly styled hair, and an aura of command that made people instinctively step aside. She was used to silence, order, and control. So the baby's crying, not far from her peaceful zone, was not something she welcomed. Rachel's eyes darted toward the source of the sound. Annoyance flickered in her expression, but before it could turn into frustration, she saw Ethan's face. He wasn't oblivious or careless, he was doing everything he could. He bounced Lily gently, whispered lullabies, even offered her his finger to grasp. His concern wasn't just for himself, he was desperately trying to stop her from bothering everyone else. Rachel tried to return to her work, but something about that image wouldn't let her go. Her mind wandered to a time long ago, before boardrooms and billion-dollar IPOs, when she'd held her own daughter in her arms, calming her in a hospital room, whispering promises she hadn't been able to keep. She shut her laptop. Then, in a moment that shocked her own assistant sitting nearby, Rachel got up and walked toward the man and his baby. "May I?" she asked softly, her voice uncharacteristically tender. Ethan blinked in surprise. Sure. I mean, if you're okay with it." Rachel sat beside him and reached out carefully for Lily, who had paused her crying just long enough to look up at the stranger. Something in Rachel's touch, or perhaps her scent, calmed Lily almost instantly. She snuggled into the woman's chest, hiccuping quietly as her eyes fluttered shut. She likes you," Ethan said, exhaling deeply for the first time in hours. Rachel smiled faintly. "She reminds me of someone." There was a long pause between them. Ethan hesitated, then added, "She's all I've got. Her mom passed away during childbirth. It's just been me and Lily since day one." Rachel looked down at the tiny sleeping bundle in her arms. Her throat tightened. "You're doing a good job," she said, and she meant it. They talked for the next 20 minutes. Ethan shared how he'd been laid off during the pandemic, how he took odd jobs to stay afloat, and how this trip was for a job interview that could change everything. Rachel listened, really listened. For the first time in a long while. Beneath his exhaustion, she saw resilience, devotion, and a quiet kind of strength she hadn't encountered in board meetings or startup pitches. When boarding was finally announced, Rachel handed Lily back to Ethan with surprising reluctance. She returned to her seat, but her heart stayed behind. The flight was short, but something about that encounter lingered with her. Back in her corner office high above the city, Rachel found herself distracted. She couldn't shake the image of the tired young father and his sleeping daughter. That night, she did something rare, she went home early. Alone in her penthouse, surrounded by silence, she opened a drawer she hadn't touched in years. Inside was a small photo of her daughter, Emma, who would have been 13 this year. Rachel had buried herself in work after the accident, using success as a shield against grief. She told herself she didn't have time for motherhood, but the truth was, she didn't know how to live with that kind of pain. She wept for the first time in years. The next morning, Rachel instructed her assistant to track down Ethan. "I want to help him," she said. "Not because he needs it, but because he deserves it." Ethan, meanwhile, had returned home disappointed. The interview hadn't gone well, the job had already been given to someone with more experience. He stared at the ceiling that night, Lily asleep in the crib beside him, wondering how much longer he could keep up this fight. Then came the knock on the door. A courier handed him an envelope with no sender. Inside was a letter and a business card. The letter was simple. "You don't know me well, but I know you're the kind of person the world needs more of. I saw a man who sacrifices everything for his daughter. I saw love, and courage, and integrity. If you're willing, I'd like you to consider working with me. Not out of charity, but because I believe you can lead people with the same heart you lead your daughter. Rachel Bennett. CEO, Bennett Technologies." Attached was an offer letter for a position in her company, entry-level, but with full benefits, daycare assistance, and remote flexibility. Ethan stared at it for a long time. His first instinct was disbelief, followed by caution. But as he looked at Lily's tiny fingers curled into her blanket, he knew he couldn't say no. He had to at least try. 6 months later, Ethan was thriving in his new role. He had a steady income, health coverage, and, most importantly, time with Lily. He often saw Rachel in the halls, though she never made a show of their connection. She always smiled gently, sometimes stopping to greet Lily when Ethan brought her in. One afternoon, Rachel asked if they could talk privately. "I just wanted you to know," she said quietly, "you gave me something that day at the airport." Ethan looked confused. "I thought you were the one helping me." Rachel shook her head. "You reminded me of what it means to care deeply, to give everything for someone else. I'd forgotten how to feel that. You gave me back a part of myself." He didn't know what to say. But as he watched the powerful woman wipe a tear from her cheek, he realized kindness doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes, it begins with a quiet act, a single dad comforting his baby in a crowded airport. A year later, Rachel officially launched a new initiative within her company, Project Heartline, a support system for single parents, working caregivers, and families in need. Ethan became its ambassador, telling his story across the country. And in every room, he ended with the same message. Sometimes, the smallest cry can be the beginning of the greatest change. Because compassion isn't about power or wealth, it's about seeing someone struggle, and deciding not to walk away. And in that airport, on an ordinary day full of noise and indifference, two strangers crossed paths, and neither of their lives were ever the same again.